In Leviticus 19:2, God says to his people, "Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." And that command seems to sum up the entire book of Leviticus, which sets up a system whereby God's people can practice holiness and so be just like the one who has rescued them from slavery in Egypt, even as he now makes his home among them. Welcome to this fourth devotional in our series on the book of Leviticus, part of the Growing Disciples course. In our journey through the book of Leviticus, we now enter the section that is most strange to the contemporary Western Christian, and most difficult to interpret for our situation, and really furthest from our culture's way of seeing the world. We have been working our way through the different tiers or layers of Leviticus, beginning with the regulations for ritual sacrifice at the tented temple of God. Then we moved inward toward the centre of the chiastic structure, considering the role of the priests in representing Israel before God and God's holiness in turn to Israel. Perhaps the most striking part of this narrative was the death of Aaron the high priest's sons, Nadab and Abihu. Fire broke out from the Holy of Holies and consumed them because they did not follow God's ritual instructions. They brought fire and incense before the altar, but in a way that somehow contravened divinely given regulations. And such immediate and punitive justice, stemming from God's absolute holiness and the abuse of priestly privilege, that sets the tone now for the next unit that deals with separating the clean from the unclean. So back in chapter 10, explaining the immediate judgment of Aaron's two sons, we read, "You and your sons, Aaron, are not to drink wine or other fermented drink whenever you go into the tent of meeting, or you will die. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, so that you can distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And so you can teach the Israelites all the decrees the Lord has given them through Moses." Aaron, as high priest, and his remaining two sons are not the same as everyone else. There is a different standard of priestly behaviour which requires them to distinguish between holy and common or ordinary, between the clean and the unclean. And these distinctions are to be widely understood and taught to the people. So there are two category distinctions here: clean and unclean, holy and common. For our purposes today, setting aside a more technical dissection, we could say that things, places and people which are directly related to God and in close proximity to Him, these things are holy. This holy category of people and things includes priests and tabernacle, sacrifices and tools for worship. Things, places and people that are not in this category are common, ordinary, sometimes profane. And these not holy or unholy things had better be clearly separated from the holy realm, because God's holiness cannot be compromised or mixed with anything common, as Nadab and Abihu found out. Now there's also this further distinction among things that are common or ordinary. Some things are clean and suitable for ordinary use or consumption or activity, but others are not. They are unclean, and they defile a person, such that they need to be purified and cleansed before that person stands in right relationship with God again, able to participate in the life of God's people. And it's these distinctions, holy and common, clean and unclean, that circumscribe the life of God's people, and especially their priests. In the book of Leviticus, there are two large sections of text that define what is clean or unclean and what is holy and what is not. They're chapters 11 through 15 and 17 through 24. So, for example, in chapters 11 through 15, all sorts of food and animals may or may not be eaten. In short, pigs, camels, hyraxes, rabbits, rats, weasels, lizards, prawns, shellfish, and so many other things, they're off the menu. And in fact, their dead carcasses cannot be touched, or you will be made unclean. But then it gets more complicated, because in chapters 12 through 15 we find uncleanness comes from several kinds of bodily discharges, including menstruation, childbirth, skin diseases, boils, swelling, red spots, and mildew. Most of these situations we would call natural processes over which we have little control. But throughout, for each situation, rites of purification are prescribed to move people and things back into cleanliness or cleanness. And as contemporary Western readers, all these food and cleanliness regulations don't immediately seem to express holiness to us. We can see that there might be value and good reasons for categorising safe or unsafe practices, or even good and better practices, but our challenge is that once we get into the details of what's in and what's out, it makes little sense to us. The distinctions don't seem to operate on the basis of utility or public health or even discernibly good hygiene. Occasionally there are hints of this, but never once are those reasons advanced for making these distinctions. Instead, the only reason given is holiness. Making these distinctions and keeping things separate, clean and unclean, is somehow connected to Israel being holy, just as God is holy. And it's that principle that we need to keep in mind as we move on from that first unit, chapters 11 through 15, to the complementary section of regulations in Leviticus 17 through 24. Again, clear distinctions are drawn between the holy and the profane or the common. For example, to sacrifice anywhere away from the temple, well, the tabernacle, makes the sacrifices unholy, potentially being offered to another deity other than God, which is, of course, idolatry. The priests and the tabernacle remain the only gateway to worship God. In the same way that foreign sacrificial practices are banned, so too are the sexual practices of other nations. So, in Leviticus 18, we read, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord." And then follows a very lengthy list of prohibited sexual practices. You can read them for yourself later if you want. And at the end of this list, we read, "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you. The land became defiled. And if you defile the land, I'll vomit you out of it as I vomited out the nations that were before you." So the clues have been building throughout the book of Leviticus, clues as to why these distinctions and regulations are treated with such weightiness and severe consequences. Now that underlying principle becomes clear. God's people are to be holy, just as God is holy, which means that they must maintain holy separation and distinctiveness from the surrounding nations, especially when they move into their promised land of Canaan. You see, the practical effect of all their food laws and hygiene laws is to make hospitality between Jews and non-Jews pretty much impossible. Friendly relations will effectively be blocked by Israel's need to be ritually clean. Similarly, Israel's sexual purity practices, holiness in the most personal areas of life, they will similarly create a clear distinction and a barrier between God's people and the surrounding nations. The detestable sexual and worship practices of the surrounding nations made them so abhorrent to God, he ultimately brings judgment upon them, using his people of Israel as his instruments. And so for this reason, God's holy people will be must be intentionally different, a bit strange and weird even in the eyes of the rest of the world. Their holiness, mirroring the holiness of their God, will prevent easily mingling and easy friendly ties. They are set apart for God. And as Christians, I take it we should expect to experience that too. And yet, our holiness within the world is put on a different footing, for Jesus himself prays these things for us. But now I am coming to you, Jesus speaking to his Father, and these things I speak in the world, that they, my disciples, may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. I leave this for your reflection today.